As a tiny, hyper-rich segment of society attempts to undermine our democracy by grossly distorting the distribution of wealth, unions remain the last best hope for working families. Recent attacks on public sector workers in Wisconsin and elsewhere, and as we've also heard over the last few days in Alberta and other parts of Canada, have prompted an unprecedented grassroots response. This presentation that we're going to hear explores the context and prospects for the growing movement by workers to take back their rights and defend the basic democratic principles on which a just society rests. Stephanie Bloomingdale was first elected as Secretary-Treasurer for the Wisconsin State AFL CIO. Stephanie Bloomingdale has more than 20 years of experience in labor as an organizer, negotiator, trainer, and activist. Stephanie was formerly the Director of Public Policy for the Wisconsin Federation of Nurses and Health Professionals, where she had a key role in the struggle to strengthen the power of nurses and healthcare workers throughout Wisconsin. In arbitrations and grievance hearings, she is known as a tough negotiator. In her electoral work, she has a statewide reputation for managing effective voter mobilization campaigns and holding elected officials accountable. During her career that began as an activist at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Stephanie has been committed to the ideals of organized labor and the power of collective action to create a strong middle class. She is dedicated to building grassroots, member-driven campaigns that advocate for social and economic justice for everyone. Stephanie was raised by working-class parents who often struggled but always believed in hard work and education. Stephanie is married to Doug Savage, a member of AFT Wisconsin, and has two sons, Nicholas and Spencer, who it's my great pleasure to hear stories about last night over supper, who are often seen at rallies, phone banks, and door-to-door canvasses. And I can't think of a better person to help us understand what has been going on with the union movement in Wisconsin and in the United States than Stephanie Bloomingdale. I want you to join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for that really nice introduction. And I have to say, I really am so honored to be here with all of you today, and not only today, but throughout this weekend. The conversations have been really incredible. This Parkland Institute is really has some powerful wisdom and powerful research, and I am just so proud to be here with you this weekend. I want to thank Trevor Harrison and Gordon Laxer and Ricardo Acuna for inviting me to your conference here in Edmonton. And so, no, the water. Coffee water. But especially now, at this very, very exciting time in our history, and the title of this conference, Class Dismissed, I think fits perfectly with where we are today in our struggle. We are really at a pivot point here in our movement, and we are in the midst of building a new movement for social and economic justice. And we are all a part of this. And so our fight in Wisconsin is also your fight here in Canada, and your fight in Canada is our fight in Wisconsin. And the fact that we are meeting here today is very important, because we know that the right-wingers, the Harpers and the Rob Fords of the world are meeting in boardrooms and golf courses with the likes of Scott Walker and other right-wing politicians and other corporation heads across the world. And so, just as capital knows no borders, solidarity ought to know no borders as well. And so I would like to take a moment to recognize the amazing support that we have had in Wisconsin from Canada and specifically from Alberta. The messages of solidarity have been incredible. The financial assistance from the labor movement has been incredible. And also I know that a lot of you, there are several of you here that have actually been to Wisconsin. And I want to thank you for that. And for you who enjoyed the Wisconsin winter so much, because you're so used to that, we invite you back again as we recall Scotland. But the discussions here have been so insightful and enlightening, and this thing is crazy, and I'm short. He's a lot taller than I am. But we know that something has gone terribly wrong with the way wealth is created and distributed these days. It does, however, take some clear thinking to cut through the spin and identify the real culprits. Unfortunately, the powerful interests out there don't want working people to think too deeply about what really went wrong with our economy. As Remy Deroux, the former Bishop of Victoria, once observed, "When I give bread to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist." Similarly, some of the U.S.'s wealthiest individuals, the very people who created this economic crisis, are working behind the scenes to deflect anger against themselves and direct it towards the government and working people. They want to create a world in which they are free to operate unfettered by government regulation and unchecked by organized labor. A world in which public becomes a dirty word, when public employees, dedicated men and women, who educate our children and care for our sick and support and protect us in countless ways each day, are left to the mercy of elected right-wing ideologues who see them at best as a necessary evil and at worst as public enemies. We've all heard the well-funded spin churned out by their media outlets. They point to failing schools and blame the teachers' union. They blame crumbling infrastructure and declining public services on wasteful government spending. But look closely at who is behind today's so-called grassroots Tea Party movements, and you will find an AstroTurf agenda designed to serve the fortunate few at the expense of the rest of us. And so, yes, working people are angry. And we have every right to be. On both the right and the left in the U.S., a lot of talk these days is about taking our country back. And that's exactly what needs to happen. But before we can take it back, we need to be clear about who stole it in the first place. And like the old saying goes, the easiest way to steal from the bank is to own one. And so the gap between the rich and the poor is at an all-time high. And we know Trevor Harrison spoke to us about that yesterday in great, great detail with many really very interesting charts that are very, very alarming. But today, you know this from his talk yesterday, that right now, that the gap between the rich and the poor in the U.S. is at an all-time high. And it's even greater than the gap that existed in the Great Depression. In the U.S., the hyper-rich 1% of the population now control more wealth than the 90% combined. It seems that Uncle Sam threw a party, but before anyone else could eat, the ones from Wall Street grabbed 100 times their share. And when the rest of us sat down to the table, we were told there's not much left. So we need to be happy with less. But brothers and sisters, the only way we're going to be fed is if we make those greedy fat cats put some of the food that they took back on the table for all of us. And so there are a lot of complicated explanations that we've talked about in detail over the last couple of days to talk about what happened in our economy. But it comes down to one simple word, and that word is power. Specifically, the power to influence where the money that our economy generates goes. We know that the wealthy business owners would always like to put 100% of that profit back into their own pockets. But there are two other parties at the table with something to say about that. And as members of a democratic society, reasonable people accept that our government needs some of that money to provide money to pay for things like roads and schools and hospitals. But we know that the workers whose labor makes the businesses successful, we also want our fair share of what we produce. So in this three-way contest that has been going on since the foundation of our nations, and for a long time, workers had to take what the bosses gave to them. More often than not, that meant low wages, long hours, and working in the worst possible working conditions. Then, in the first half of the last century, as more people left the farm and for the shop floor, a great struggle began. Workers realized they would never have better lives for themselves or their families until they gained a voice in the workplace. And that great struggle has a name, and it is called the labor movement. And so gradually, through solidarity and sacrifice, workers stood together and organized unions, and the balance of power began to shift. The shift in power had a profound effect on our society. It created the foundation in the U.S. of a sound economy and of what we call the middle class. And also here in Canada, it created the middle class. And as workers in the U.S. pursued the American dream, they bought houses and cars, they sent their kids to college, and they paid taxes to create essential public services. This was when America was at its strongest and America was at its best. It came about in cities and towns across my nation because organized labor had gained the power to elect responsible politicians and make the bosses do the right thing. But in our prosperity, we forgot a fundamental truth. We began to believe that the struggle had been won. We believed that the hard-fought gains of those union brothers and sisters that went before us were permanent. But the bosses did not forget. They met our demands at the bargaining table, and they waited for another day. After time, changes in technology and international political environment began to forge connections between the economies of countries in a way that had never happened before. The bosses saw an opportunity. Suddenly, corporations could exploit cheap labor across the world, freeing them from the demands of the local workforce. Labor became a global commodity that could be purchased at the lowest point anywhere. More jobs moved overseas, and the bosses threatened many more would go as well if we didn't agree to their concessions. The corporate leaders and the shareholders were happy, but the workers began to lose ground. And this is not just a threat to labor. It's a threat to the very foundation of our society. Because cheap labor can make cheap products, but it can't support a healthy middle class. A society made up of a few hyper-wealthy individuals at the top and the rest of the population barely getting by is not sustainable. When the middle class is gone, also is gone the customers for our goods and our services. And when the customers go, so do the businesses that produce the things they buy. And when the businesses go, so do the jobs, and the society begins to die. And so as we look around today, we see troubling signs of the process all around us. Unemployment on the rise, wages and benefits declining, money for public services so-called drying up. And in a globalized world, capital has no flag. Corporate America has abandoned Main Street. The wealthiest among us have conspired to strip us of our rights and dismantle the society that generations of our labor has built. And we need to remember that despite their fondness for patriotic rhetoric, they find democracy inherently threatening. As the former senator from Montreal, Philippe Gigante, observed, democracy pits the power of the many against the power of the moneyed. So let's be clear. Their real goal is to destroy the middle class and leave us powerless, begging at their feet for the crumbs that might fall from their table. And so, as we turn back the clock and look more recently to the mid-year elections in the US in 2010, we saw a wave of governors wholly owned by corporations sweep into the office throughout the US. Corporations like the Koch brothers, which I know that you know very well here in Alberta, who have set up shop and have been, working behind the scenes with their PACs and trying to do the same thing in Wisconsin and other places here in working with the energy sector. But these guys, these Koch brothers, sent their errand boys to do their bidding. And what did they want? They wanted these governors to crush the union movement, to crush the middle class, to silence the opposition to privatization, and to muzzle any opposition to deregulation. So why do we think that they wanted to attack unions? Because unions provide power to the working class and the middle class. Because unions provide funding and a ground game to Democratic politicians in the US. And because unions vote with higher percentages than their membership. And just as Trevor has told me last night, it's because this analogy of we punch above our weight. And so while we have a very small, and declining union density in the US, we vote at much higher levels, and therefore our vote is extremely, extremely important in these elections. And also because as unions, we have the ability to speak out about quality public services. We have the ability to speak out as working people in a union that non-union working people really cannot because they fear for their jobs. And so as Gil McGowan talked earlier today about the worldview and about this worldview that wasn't just created yesterday or the day before, but has been in the making of the right-wing ideologues for decades and decades. And so this move in 2010 really was part of a long-term plan. And just to kind of remind us, you all know who Grover Norquist is, one of the architects of the Bush tax cuts to the wealthy. He said in 1998, he said, "We are going to crush labor as a political entity and ultimately break the unions." Okay? He also said, "My goal is to cut government to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub." Okay. And then this one is really kind of, will make you shudder if you haven't heard it before. But he said of the liberal and progressive groups and democratic groups, he said, they will now have to fight each other because, now he was talking about cutting taxes, so cutting taxes and cutting services. He said now they will have to fight each other because they think there is only a little left. While we unite, the right wing unites, they will fight with each other. And each tax cut will make them fight each other even more. He went on to say that the right has the left exactly where they want them, in a glass jar like fireflies. And so you see this idea of division has been part of their overall tactics in trying to destroy any kind of unity or any kind of fight back that we have had. And so this year, in 2011, this was no different. When Scott Walker, when he and other right-wing governors throughout the country talked about this, their idea was to divide the public sector from the private sector, divide the taxpayers from the public sectors, to pit taxpayers against public workers. And they thought that if they could do that, to create those divisions, that they could win and they could strip public employees of their rights unnoticed. But in their blind arrogance, they have overreached, my friends. When the bought and paid for politicians tried to implement their outrageous schemes, a curious thing happened, and a spark was lit in Wisconsin that inspired a movement. Young and old, moms and dads, religious, farmers, union people and non-union people all understood that unions are an important part of our democracy. They provide balance in our economy. And really it is the union movement was the only power to stand up to unbridled corporate greed. And so the movement in Wisconsin was unprecedented for our state, and really just the response from people coming out was just overwhelming. I know some of you were there, some of you, saw, part of our struggles in the newspapers and on TV and through YouTube and through Facebook, but it really was quite amazing to see, the first day with 10,000 people, and the 7th day with 50,000 people, and the 14th day with 80,000 people, and the 21st day with 150,000 people standing in Madison saying, we want our state back, we want our democracy back, we want to make sure that people have a right to have a voice in the union, and we are going to fight. We're not going to go home and sit on our couches. We are going to be watching you, Scott Walker, each and every day. So not only did we see, which was really cool to be in Madison through all that, but also in small towns and medium-sized towns throughout Wisconsin. We saw, even in my hometown, a very small town, this is a town of about 15,000 people. There were 3,000 people on the streets saying no to Scott Walker, saying no to Scott Walker. So we saw these people coming out, not only in Wisconsin, but also throughout the U.S., and indeed also here in Canada, of people saying, you know what, that might not be our governor, but it could be our governor. And we know that if we don't stop him in his tracks now, if we don't send a message that is loud and that is clear, that the people of the world, the people that care about justice, economic justice and social justice, will do all we can to stop his radical and aggressive and dangerous agenda. And so really we're so proud to have been, part of all of this, but really again, it's all of our struggle, and the solidarity messages that we had come from throughout the world was really, really incredible. As was, another part of what we were doing was we were occupying the Capitol. We can't forget about that. But, we occupied the Capitol for close to, a 2-3 weeks. And that was really incredible. And that came out of, and I don't know if you guys knew about this part of it, but when the bill was introduced, they have a hearing. The Senate and the Assembly have hearings on bills, right? Just like you do here. Well, more than 3,000 people handed in slips to be able to testify at that hearing. But the Republicans said when it got to be, and they had decided this early on, and we got wind of it, that they were going to stop the debate about 2 in the morning. And so we knew that this was going to be the first time in history, in Wisconsin's political history, that debate would be stopped. Because normally our history in Wisconsin is to allow everyone, they might not have 10 minutes to talk, they may only have a minute each, but each one of them is allowed to talk. But this time, Scott Walker and his Republican allies said, you know what, again, this democracy is too messy, we are just going to stop debate. And at that time, the Democrats in the Assembly held their own listening sessions and kept the Capitol open and kept people coming in and allowing them to speak their mind about this issue. And it was at that time that people brought the sleeping bags and the pillows and the teddy bears into the Capitol to occupy the Capitol. So, and at the same time, you know, we cannot forget about our fabulous 14 senators, Democratic senators, that said, you know what, if we leave the state, they will not be able to have quorum. And this is a tactic that we stole from Texas, of all places. They've done it before. But our senators left the state and went to Illinois so that they could not have quorum. And we are so very, very proud, of those senators who stood up for workers' rights. And so that was really quite amazing, and really, they really are our heroes for working people everywhere. You know, speaking of sleeping on the streets, we also had what we called our own Walkerville. You may be, in history, you may know about Hooverville in the 1930s, where, you know, the bonus army came to D.C. to protest the horrible, you know, the wages that they were not receiving and the economic conditions. And so we took a spin on that and called it Walkerville and set up our tents outside of the Capitol for several weeks. And, you know, so some people say, was it easier to sleep on the Capitol floor, on the marble floor, or outside on the street? You know, I don't know. It's a horse apiece. Inside the Capitol, it's quiet because they stop the drum circle at about 9 o'clock at night. So that makes it, you know, but the floors are hard. But you know, in the tent, you can have an air mattress. But it's really noisy in Madison all night long. So I really don't know which is better. But at any rate, it was it called attention to the outrageousness of these bills that they were passing left and right. In the same time, you may remember that we started the summer recalls. And so this was the most recalls that have been generated anywhere in the history of the United States, and that was in Wisconsin. And so these were districts that were very Republican dominated. Remember, these were districts that were won by Republicans in the 2008 Democratic wave with the Obama wave. And so these were tough districts to start with. But we were successful in defending 3 of our Democratic senators, the guys and the women that stood up for us by leaving the state, and we defended all of them, and we were able to pick up 2 more of their senators who stood with Scott Walker to pass this immoral bill in the middle of the night. And so we were very happy with that. And the other thing that we saw happen throughout this period is that we saw Scott Walker's polling numbers plummet. We saw his popularity go down the drain, okay? So he may not have known all of this before. But my friends, I have to tell you, he knows it now. And so now we move on to our next part of our struggle, and that is to recall Scott Walker. So we have 540,000 signatures to collect. Not so bad, right? And we have 60 days to do it in. And I am happy to report to you that since the 15th, which is just a few days ago, we have collected more than 105,000 signatures. And we had a rally yesterday, which I'm happy to report to you as well. 30,000 people came to the streets of Madison to kick off this recall and to say we will not stop until we get it done. So it's been an exciting time, and I have to do mention about Ohio as well. I was in Ohio for the election there, which was, if you're not familiar with it, Governor John Kasich from Ohio passed a similar bill which stripped union rights away from public sector workers in Ohio. They have different rules in Ohio than we have in Wisconsin, but what they did was they had a referendum which would overturn that piece of legislation. The piece of legislation was called Senate Bill 5, and they collected signatures to overturn that bill, and they collected 1.3 million signatures to overturn that union-busting bill. And not only did they collect those signatures, but on November 8th, they won their vote. And they won. A full 90% of union members voted no on issue 2, which is quite incredible because, not always do all the union members vote like we want them to. We're still, wondering about the 10%. But more interestingly, 51% of independents voted no on 2. Okay?